French Revolution. D.W. Griffith returns to historical spectacle. Danton leads the cavalry to save an innocent girl from the guillotine. Griffith has perfected his technique of cross-cutting. Now almost every director tries to emulate the whirlwind cutting of a Griffith climax. Before he thought of making this film, Griffith had to decide between two favorite projects: Faust and a rural drama Richard Barthelmess wanted to do, Tolerable David. Lillian Gish was worried that if Griffith made Faust, it would not be popular.
Harry Carr, who was in the script department, also worried. He said, don't let him make Faust. He'll just give him a chance to preach. But I couldn't tell him what to do, of course, as no one could do that, but I could gently suggest. And I looked up something called The Two Orphans and found that it had been translated into 40 different languages, and always a success, wherever it played.
The story was about two girls, Henriette and Louise, both orphans. Louise is blind. They journey to Paris, where Henriette is abducted by orders of a marquis. The girls have never before been separated. To this story, Griffith added the French Revolution. German spectacles like Madame du Barry, released in America as Passion, had caused tremendous excitement. Griffith appeared supremely confident that he could outdo himself, but actually these new rivals worried him. He poured resources into the picture. The sets covered half the acreage at Mamaroneck. An army of technicians and craftsmen recreated 18th century Paris with as much care as their European counterparts. Extras so cheap and plentiful in Germany were more difficult to obtain in Mamaroneck.
I think the whole town of Mamaroneck was in it, and there was a lot of people from New York coming down.
Griffith had to impress on the unruly elements the seriousness of the operation.
They were young fellas, you know, so they had these big rifles. And one of the boys just was poking me in the back. D.W. Griffith saw him do this, and he came over. He grabbed him by the back of the shirt or neck, whatever he had there, and he said, get off the set. He says, this is $1 million picture.
This is the same set as used for the guillotine, photographed from another angle. The scenes of street fighting were carefully controlled, like all Griffith's battles, but the use of firearms, even with blank charges, still called bullets by some, was highly dangerous.
I was out there giving guys bullets. So what happened? This guy must have been, he was in the crowd, he must have had his gun underneath here, see? Right underneath his arm. So the bullet went off. I rushed to get a pail of water. So it was no use. They took him to the hospital, and then later on I found out he passed away.
A visitor to Mamaroneck was the French director Abel Gance. His epic Napoleon would owe much to Griffith's influence, a romantic historical epic with strong intimate scenes. Louise is forced to beg by singing in the street, and in this street, unknown to her, lives her sister. Griffith shows his mastery by basing the scene on a sound we cannot hear. Yet he loses none of the emotion. Griffith had gone well over budget, but his confidence seemed to have paid off. The film was highly praised, and the public flocked to see it. Griffith was invited to the White House with the Gish sisters to show the film privately to the new president, Warren G. Harding. Griffith was now one of the great men of America, sought for his wisdom as the head of a great industry. He'd done more than any other man to bring this prestige to the motion picture. The middle classes were at last packing the theatres, but they weren't quite the audiences Griffith had hoped for. They seemed to prefer frivolity to his grand operas. Orphans would have done well, but Griffith spent far too much on lavish roadshows. The film did not prove profitable. The photoplay medal, the Oscar of its day, went to the film Griffith had passed over. On top of this, the last important members of his family were leaving him. Lillian Gish went to join Richard Barthelmess and her sister in an independent company. Billy Bitzer's departure was due to alcoholism. He had become the most famous cameraman in the world. Now he worked for Griffith occasionally as a secondary cameraman. The American film industry was established in California. Going up around Hollywood were modern studios geared to turning out 52 pictures a year. Many were potboilers, which paid for the prestige productions. Griffith had to do the same thing on his lonely peninsula at Mamaroneck. He needed a flow of cheap pictures to pay for his overheads. The trouble was he had to make them himself. One Exciting Night starred Henry Hull and Carol Dempster. It was a comedy thriller inspired by a Broadway hit called The Bat. Carol Dempster thought she'd been in enough minor films. She wanted one with a typical Griffith finish, like Way Down East. What about a storm? Griffith spent an enormous sum on the storm. It involved the Mamaroneck Fire Brigade, which had to supply the rain. Harry Sullivan, now in his 90s, was one of the firemen.
They built a great big platform, and they had an airplane propeller up there. And they had somebody up there, they had already cut the branches, see? And we took 2 lines of hose, and we had one coming this way, and the other one coming that way. And we threw the water right in front of these big propellers. and we were waiting for the signal to throw these branches by a man by the name of John Elf, who had a voice like a big loudspeaker. When he gave the word, we started to throw these branches to beat hell.
Some of the larger branches were flown on wires.
And that wires very close to the ground. And as she got past that tree, they pulled that wire, and down would come your tree, and you think she was underneath. Carol Dempster, she never doubled anybody. She did all the acting herself. Everything that happened in the scene was done by her and Mr. Hull.
One exciting night made money, but Griffith spent so much on the storm his mounting debts weren't covered, and his other potboilers flopped.
Part of the glories of Griffith is that his potboilers, which are intended sheerly to make money, are almost always disasters. That he's terrible as a director who simply wants to capitalize on the latest fad.
He tried to create a fad in 1921.
When Mr. Griffith was making Dream Street, he introduced sound. It opened here on 43rd Street at the Town Hall.
He used an early sound system invented by Orlando Cullen.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to say a few words concerning the play of Dream Street, which you are about to see. Dream Street. I wonder if there isn't a dream street running through the heart and soul of every human being in the world.
But Kellum Talking Pictures didn't prove to be a success, and after about 3 engagements, the films continued to be shown, the short subjects continued to be shown for a while, but Dream Street was again reduced to being a silent film. And really, the use of sound in Dream Street was not Mr. Griffith's idea. It was Kellum's idea, and it was really a method of, I guess, making some money for a film that was really a failure.
Griffith went to Louisiana to make The White Rose with the British actor Ivan Novello. It also marked the return of one of his favorite actresses, Mae Marsh.
He is one of those intractables that ever much he would love to sell out to a fashion, to the new jazz age, just can't bring it off. And of course, how this gets translated is that he can't keep up with the times.
The confrontation of British troops and rebel militia at Lexington was staged at Mamaroneck. Griffith said that if America was a flop, his company was doomed. Griffith had been given the idea by the industry watchdog Will Hayes. Hayes wanted patriotic films to reflect credit on an industry which had been shaken by a series of scandals. With the support of the Daughters of the American Revolution, Griffith threw himself into the task of bringing history alive. Old North Church looked the same, but Boston had changed, so Griffith recreated it with a special effect for the Ride of Paul Revere. He rode to warn rebel Minutemen that the British were on the march. The ride was filmed at Somers, New York.
They had the cemetery in Somers. After they took it, they realized there's telephone poles there. There ain't supposed to be any telephone poles in them days, so they had to camouflage them, make them look like trees and retake it.
told that the man who played Paul Revere was drunk all during the filming, but surprisingly didn't break his neck.
Undeterred by rising costs, Griffith spent his usual time perfecting the spectacle.
I think he was an extremely extravagant man, because there would be dozens and dozens of our local people dressed in costume, hanging around there day after day after day, never being called for anything, maybe once in a week or something. In the meantime, all that money was just going to waste.
Griffith staged the Battle of Bunker Hill outside Somers. The inspiration for the scene, as so often in the past, was a famous painting. This one was by Howard Pyle. Sections of infantry regiments were loaned by the War Department to play British troops. The government saw this patriotic film as politically valuable. Griffith desperately needed snow to recreate Valley Forge, Washington's darkest hour, when he and his army faced defeat, and the premiere was getting closer. Without snow, the scene wasn't authentic. Just 4 days before the premiere, Griffith got the snow he'd prayed for. The film opened in New York to a great deal of acclaim. Griffith had every reason to think that, like Washington, he'd snatched victory from defeat. But then the atmosphere changed. Many critics derided it. Box office takings dropped. One reviewer complained that an epic had been allowed to dwindle to sheer melodrama. The story, woven around a family like The Birth of a Nation, was described as dull. The daughters of the American Revolution strongly objected to the sex. Griffith realized he had lost the battle. He still had a great deal of valuable work to do, but the failure of America marked the end of his role as the leader of the film industry. I feel tonight, he wrote to a friend during the making of America, that I would be much happier at anything else than directing pictures. When the 20s began to roar, Griffith began to look old-fashioned. His films appealed less and less to young audiences. In any case, Griffith was in financial trouble. His studio was on the market. He had debts that would finish a lesser man. Does he embark on another spectacle to try and save the day? No, he goes to Germany. Germany was in a state of political turmoil and economic collapse. It was the year of Hitler's Munich Putsch. It was the year the French had invaded the Ruhr when Germany couldn't pay her reparations. Griffith shot these scenes of the dispossessed Germans in flight. In their shame and humiliation, He saw what his own people had suffered after the Civil War. Griffith's indignation was aroused by this German government report, which accused the French. He cast Neil Hamilton as a German policeman gassed by the French. Carol Dempster was his fiancée Inga. Neil Hamilton was impressed by Griffith's concern for authenticity, right down to his costume.
So he said to me, now I'll tell you what we're going to do. I realize, he said, that you think these things don't exactly become you. But he said, I just want to be sure, because he said, I can't quite tell myself. Let's go downstairs. And to the clerk, he said, we'd only be gone for 15 or 20 minutes. I just want to see him walk up and down the streets, and if he attracts too much attention, then I'll know that the clothes are not right. But if he doesn't, so downstairs, I saw the episode with, I have to walk outside in these things? He said, yes, Neil, yes, of course. So I started to walk up into the Linden, looking in the windows, and I stopped to buy a paper and across the street, and nobody paid any attention to me. And the streets were filled with young men, dressed as I was, some of them a little better, and many of them a great deal worse.
Griffith was capturing an event other film directors would rather have avoided. He staged many telling moments, the desperate need for food affecting society at every level. Turnips are all the family has to eat. Griffith wanted his film to be used in a campaign to lighten German reparations. Runaway inflation. Every day the cost of living doubled. Inga's week's wages are only 12 million marks. She can just afford some meat. This sequence was a race to the rescue in reverse. Inga stands still while events are racing before her.
The reviews for Isn't Life Wonderful are favorable, but the critics are unanimous in worrying that this is uncommercial.
By the time Griffith had completed additional scenes at Mamaroneck, he'd abandoned his attack on the French. He also abandoned his support for the Germans and transformed his family into Poles. A happy ending was a late addition. Some reviewers denigrated the film. "They don't make 'em any worse," said one. Erich Pommer, Germany's greatest producer, wrote to Griffith, "We cannot see our way to propagate a production that glorifies a bushel of potatoes as the thing to be most coveted by German citizens. The film was never shown in Germany. The leading fan magazine attacked Griffith for losing touch with the public. Let someone take charge of your soul for a year, they said. Faust tried it and had a good time. Ricardo Cortez and Adolphe Marjou as the devil in Griffith's modern version of Faust. Griffith had joined Paramount and found himself an employee of Adolphe Zukor. Paramount's resident genius, Cecil B. DeMille, was about to quit. DeMille had quarreled with Paramount over a property called The Sorrows of Satan. When DeMille left, they passed the property to Griffith. Based at Paramount's Astoria studios in New York, Griffith had made 2 films with W.C. Fields. He had already considered The Sorrows of Satan, and he didn't want to make it. The studio insisted. It was to be their biggest production of the year. Charles Kirk, the art director who had built Old Paris for Griffith, now created London for him at Astoria. Paramount assigned him a brilliant cameraman, Harry Fishbeck, who achieved some of the finest lighting seen in the studio. Like Faust, Griffith was delighted by the expenditure which the studio lavished upon him. On a visit to the studio, the atmosphere so impressed Ricardo Cortez's brother that he was inspired to join the industry himself.
The door opened up. Now the scene starts. I looked in the distance and there was a blaze of light. I looked up on top and there were hundreds of Cooper-Ute lights. And I was taken by all this. And the closer I got, the more music I was hearing. As I came to the threshold, so to speak, of the set, I saw hundreds of people there. I would say about 300 people, and a huge orchestra. And there are about 4 or 5 cameras, and there sat on the platform the great David Wark Griffith.
Paramount had been proud to welcome Griffith. Now they had misgivings. He was taking too long in rehearsals. His methods were unacceptable to the front office. Griffith felt sabotaged by the overheads they piled on the film, sending it way over budget. The final reckoning was about to come. The opening was a gala occasion, but Griffith soon learned the truth. The box office failure was so disastrous that Paramount blamed it for the temporary closure of Astoria Studios. And yet Griffith had managed to put a lot of himself into the film. Here, Ricardo Cortez reads a poem to Carol Dempster, just as Griffith had done to his wife Linda 20 years before. Carol Dempster, who had been so close, chose this moment to leave Griffith.
He is devastated, and in many ways he never recovers from that for the rest of his film career. The separation between Carol Dempster and Griffith is an illustration of a director who goes crazy with the loss of someone he loves so much. And this is one of the earliest instances we have of his going to drink. It's unfair to say that the drinking became a serious problem, but it certainly was a response to this trauma.
The new box office triumphs, like The Big Parade, were being made by much younger directors. King Vidor, who greatly admired Griffith. Raoul Walsh, who was trained by Griffith, as were Sidney Franklin, Woody Van Dyke, Victor Fleming. When Griffith returned to Los Angeles for the first time in his career, he'd not made a film for a year. Douglas Fairbanks was there to meet him, and Erich von Stroheim, who was also having trouble with producers. Joseph Schenck, head of United Artists, gave Griffith what the press called his comeback. Griffith's last silent films were indifferently received in spite of their visual gloss. But experiments with sound in Lady of the Pavements showed he could handle the new medium. His first talking picture, Abraham Lincoln, the Friend of the South, was a hero to Griffith, and with Walter Houston as Lincoln, he made a film of great feeling. Some of its best moments were silent, like this scene where Lincoln calls for the first volunteers to serve in the Civil War.
Griffith was a very emotional man once he became involved. Down deep, he was trying to impart to the world what he himself felt as a Southerner.
Most early talkies were static, but not Griffith's.
I thought it was a remarkable thing that the man who had first revealed the full capacities of the silent film had now gone farther than anybody else had gone to revealing the full capacities of the talking film. But as you know, that did not happen. He did not get any further opportunities.
Despite its achievements, Abraham Lincoln failed at the box office. Griffith left Schenck. He was on his own again. Lillian Gish had always kept in touch.
He said, I have a cold. Don't come near me. You'll catch it. And so I didn't. I knew his fear of germs. And Harry Carr said he didn't have a cold. He had been drinking, and he didn't want you to know it. Because I'd never seen Mr. Griffith when he was drinking.
I only had a few, Mama, honest. Gee, if I knew you felt that way about it, I'd never touch that stuff as long as I live.
As in so many of his biographs, Griffith's new picture was about the dangers of alcohol. Now he had to raise the money himself. Playing a role in the film was Griffith's future wife, Evelyn Baldwin.
The day-by-day mishaps were pretty frequent. Even during the course of shooting, there were problems with money, lack of, and the equipment.
Griffith overcame the drawbacks with some remarkable location shooting with natural sound.
Hey, you've built metal before. Do it again and you're out. Yeah. You heard me. Hey, clean those strainers out. Keep clean. What's the matter with it? That's right. Pour it right straight down.
One brand new device was a parabolic microphone, which enabled him to focus on voices and diminish extraneous sound. Much of the film was shot in the streets, and Griffith, now nearly 60, found it all very hard work.
By the time the day was over, Griffith was very tense and constantly walking up and down, up and down, up and down, thinking of what can be done to save this film.
The film featured Hal Skelly and Zita Johann.
I was only aware of a happy man doing the work he liked and liking all around him. That's all I was aware of, and I'm very sensitive to the vibes of other people. I mean, you have to be as an actress, but he shut out the world. He shut out whatever was unpleasant and gave his best to his work.
The film ended with a Griffith climax. The father, now a hopeless alcoholic, is discovered by his daughter in a slum.
Let me alone. Get out of here. Not me. Spill metal. You hear me? Spill metal. Pop the bullet. Pop the bullet.
Hurry up, hurry, will you? No, over here, please. Please, hurry up.
I thought that it was the throwback to the biographs. Its technique was almost as simple as that of the biographs, but I thought it had considerable power. I couldn't understand why it had been such a failure, except that it was probably too serious a film for the mood of the times in which it came out.
What hard edge the picture may have had, Griffith softened by a happy ending.
Daddy.
It didn't help. The film was greeted by the worst reviews Griffith had ever had. It's all too sad, said Photoplay. The film was taken off after a week. Griffith had reissued The Birth of a Nation in sound. He shot a prologue with Walter Houston.
It's an old army saber, worn by a Confederate officer.
Thank you, Walter. I like that. My father wore a sword like that.
He also re-released a sound version of his 1920 triumph, Way Down East. Griffith attempted to find a new audience through radio without much success. Eventually he went back to Kentucky, to La Grange, a little town which had changed little since his youth. He settled in this house he'd built for his mother, now occupied by his brother Will and family. Contradictory as always, Griffith also lived in hotels, but his brother marked the famous resident as though he were a film star. Apart from that, his family paid no attention to his flops or his successes. They loved him for himself. As head of the family, Griffith had supported his relatives most of his working life. He was also generous to the children. Griffith was fond of children, although he never had any of his own. And life in Kentucky made a pleasant change from the tension of film production. But although he wrote a lot and dictated his memoirs, the call of films was still strong. In 1935, he was invited to England to remake Broken Blossoms. After a dispute with the producer, he returned to Kentucky. Griffith married Evelyn Baldwin in 1936. That very day, the Academy telephoned. He was to be awarded an honorary Oscar. He and Evelyn took the train to Los Angeles. No film survives of his receiving the Oscar from Henry B. Walthall. Newsreel outtakes show rehearsals for presentations to Victor McLaglen and Betty Davis. They show an unexpectedly skittish Griffith.
What does that mean?
Well, I used to, though I was going to strike him. How's that? Something new.
That strikes me as being all right at that.
I have to do this. He's too tall.
Okay, all right.
All I can say is I'm exceedingly happy.
When he was given the award, the entire audience just stood up en masse and roared and applauded, I think, for nearly 2 minutes. It was overwhelming. He was very proud to have such honor from his peers. He was really quite joyous, and I'm sure he had every reason to believe that he did have a future still in Hollywood.
I knew he had not had a job for some time. I was working at MGM. I had very close, intimate feelings with Irving Thalberg, who was running the studio. So I went to Irving, and I told him, and I thought that this great pioneer should not be neglected, and maybe Irving would give him a job. We were using all kinds of directors, of course, and Irving refused. He simply said, I've had experience with him. Don't forget, I am running the studio the way I want to run it. If Mr. Griffith comes in, he will be telling me how I must run the studio. And I can't do that with him, and we will get into some terrible fights, and rather than take the chance of that, I'm not going to hire him.
Hal Roach gave him a job on 1 million BC, and Griffith helped with the casting. Otherwise, nothing came of his involvement. Griffith was too big for a place in the industry. He was looked upon with too much awe. But Griffith was restless. He gave Evelyn a movie camera, and they set off around America at the beginning of the war. Richard Reynolds, who became a close friend, was chauffeur for much of the time. And eventually Griffith learned to drive himself.
He'd go to any lengths to make sure that you enjoyed something that he had enjoyed at some other time, and he wanted you to enjoy it just as much. We went just everywhere that his mood struck him. There were no pre-planned things. It was all spontaneous.
Barry of the Museum of Modern Art staged a retrospective to honor Griffith. When they saw the display and the films, people were amazed at the range and the quality of his work.
It was kind of a low period in Griffith's career, and I think Iris Berry did succeed in calling attention to him, as she was indeed calling attention to the history of film. And she said, here's one of the great masters. And indeed, her first book about Griffith was called D.W. Griffith, American Film Master.
Even in the industry, he was considered to have invented everything to do with motion pictures. Supposing I'd patented the fade-out and the dissolve, he said in this article, I'd be drawing millions a year in royalties. But Griffith didn't invent either. This dissolve is from 1904. And anyway, the device derived from magic lanterns. Griffith's press agent took this advertisement when he left Biograph in 1913, claiming he had founded the technique of the art. Yet here is a tracking shot made in 1904 by Billy Bitzer. Griffith, who thought the moving camera distracting, didn't ask him to do it again for years.
Oh, well, people think that he invented everything. But of course, he became famous for those things because he did them so well, and because things that people might have tried before, he began to find really expressive uses for.
As a story belongs to the artist who tells it best, so these devices belong to Griffith because he used them best. From cold celluloid, Griffith transferred warm emotion. As Chaplin had put it, he was the teacher of us all. Griffith now lived with his wife in Beverly Hills, where he worked on a play called The Treadmill, about the waste of meaningless labor. But he found writing intolerably hard, and often stopped work and started on another idea. He continued to travel, and he continued to drink, convinced, like the character in The Struggle, that he could do so in moderation. He also refused to deny his interest in women.
Things developed that we simply could not continue together.
I believe today they call it unresolvable differences. He was drinking then, yes, but that was not the major problem. After talking, we decided the best thing was to sue for divorce.
The Griffiths were divorced in November 1947.
I realized I had made a mistake. I think perhaps things could have turned out differently. I'm sorry they didn't.
Griffith haunted all-night restaurants where William Bakewell found him.
I looked in there, and there sitting all alone inside was Mr. Griffith. So I got out of my car, I went over, and he said, "Billy, how are you?" You know, in this voice. And, but he was sitting alone, and it gave me a feeling that he had been sadly neglected by the business he created, you know. I don't think that he was treated as nicely as he should have been. And here was a man that, God knows, should be revered by the entire motion picture business. He created it, in a sense. He was a national monument.
The Museum of Modern Art had acquired the Griffith letters and papers and were cataloguing them. Eileen Bowser learned from them of his sense of insecurity at his lack of education.
Also, you discover that he has to have been a kind of lonely man, working night and day, especially during those early years at Biograph, and then never really having a home life, except for a few years in the 30s after he had stopped making films, living always in hotel rooms.
He had always enjoyed hotel life. He had many visitors, but they all spoke of his loneliness. There was talk of another marriage to an air stewardess, but in July 1948, Griffith died. A ceremony was held at the Hollywood Masonic Temple. Many names of the silent era attended. Chaplin and Mack Sennett, Will Hayes and Cecil B. DeMille, Madame Saulté-Wan, who was in The Birth of a Nation and had been a friend ever since, and Louis B. Mayer.
And they all said wonderful things about the lonesome man and the neglected artist, wonderful, brave things that he had done, and then they committed themselves to saying they were sorry they hadn't helped. They were sorry they hadn't given him another chance, a job in their studio. And then they talked about a towering monument that should be at Hollywood and Vine or some special place so the whole world would know about him. It didn't happen.
D.W. Griffith was called the father of film, but the art and the industry he fathered outstripped him long before his career was over. Now that his life was over, no one knew quite how to commemorate it. He was buried in Kentucky. Eventually, the Directors Guild provided a new gravestone, and in 1950, a modest ceremony was held to celebrate an extraordinary life. Mary Pickford, Richard Barthelmess, Lillian Gish, and Evelyn Griffith paid their last respects. All we can do, said Griffith, is to weave a little romance as pleasantly as we know how.
He was a man of greatness, ability, humor, enthusiasm, great charm. He was a man of great dreams, many of which he carried out. I know many of his dreams went to his grave with him, not carried out, but I don't think it was for lack of trying. He was a man of the ages, I think, one of the truly great men of his age.
Misunderstood at the time of its release, but now considered one of the greatest films ever made, Channel 4 presents D.W. Griffith's masterpiece, Intolerance, this Saturday afternoon at 12:15. And starting next Tuesday night at 9, a feature-length episode opens Channel 4's 5-part dramatization of Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City.